Hey, are you considering making your own setting for a D&D game? Or maybe you're already in the process of doing that, but having a tough time? I think I might have some advice that could help with that. I've been a DM for 5 years, and while I'm definitely not a professional with published content, this is something I've done for fun almost my entire life. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved coming up with my own stories in my head, and when I started playing D&D, I finally had an outlet to express all of those ideas. So I'm going to share some of my thoughts and methods that work for me. I'll cover 3 broad ideas in this video, but there are so many different methodologies for this that I might make more of these in the future. If you haven't already done this yourself, I want you to ask yourself why you're choosing to do this instead of running a game in a published, pre-made setting. Why do you want to create your own world? This isn't like a "do you have what it takes" kind of question. This is a "what are you hoping to get out of this" kind of question. What do you think you can offer, or what do you want to see in your own setting that sets it apart from other settings? Think about why you want to do this. And while you watch the rest of the video, think about how my advice can apply to what you want. If you're just world building for D&D, you don't need to have an actual fully fleshed out world. You don't need to write 12,000 years of your world's history, or know the inner workings of a country's political system, or have entire continents fully mapped out. If you're just starting out, my advice would be to focus on what is immediately around the player characters first. Focus on the parts of the world that are part of the adventures. This is a priority system that I usually try to loosely follow when I'm doing any kind of D&D world building. For me, the top priority is what's around the players. This doesn't necessarily mean things that are physically around them within the world, but rather things that are relevant to the immediate story or adventure. This would consist of things like, but not limited to, the area the adventure is taking place in, any NPCs relevant to that adventure, maybe even lore or history that's part of the plot. The next tier is the background. In this tier, I'd put anything that isn't really related to the current story or adventure, but is still part of the world and figuratively within reach of the players. Anything with a presence that they might be aware of and could seek out and interact with in the future if they want to. Like, if there's an oppressive empire in your setting, but it's not yet relevant to the current adventure, maybe you should write up some info about them so they can have a presence within the world. Stuff like this is really good for setting up potential future stories, and it lets the players know that there's more stuff out there in the world. The bottom tier for me is out of sight, out of mind. These are things that the players don't know about, things that are in the world to make it make sense, but aren't at all relevant to the story and possibly never will be. If the background tier consists of known unknowns, basically things your players are aware they don't know much about, then this tier would be the unknown unknowns, things your players don't know that they don't know. For me, this is almost for meta-level stuff, like really deep lore or history that's good for me to have because it helps me get a sense of how this world works, but the players might not ever interact with this stuff. That's why I put those kinds of things at the bottom priority. If you're just starting out, I'd recommend focusing your world building on the first tier, and slowly expand out into the second whenever you feel more comfortable. For the bottom tier, personally, I only work on that stuff when I get those 3 a.m. shower ideas. Don't judge me. I won't usually go out of my way to come up with stuff for that tier, but if an idea hits me, I'll add it to my notes somewhere. This priority list is just a way to recognize where you should be focusing your creative time. If you do have 12,000 years of lore and history written out, that's really cool, but it doesn't make the game fun or even functional if you don't have any world building that pertains to the actual adventures the players are in. I'd also like to say I don't treat it like a bar iron law either. Sometimes things can move from one tier to another depending on how the story is progressing. As the players make their way through the world, some things become more relevant, and other things fade into the background. So here's the thing with originality, in my opinion. When you look at everything zoomed way out, every story has already been told. When you were in school, you may have been taught some of the different literary conflicts, like man versus man versus nature, man versus technology, those kinds of things. All of those boil down to this versus that. All stories are conflict in some way, even if it's not direct. So I'm of the opinion that all forms of media are derivative in some way. Everything is inspired by everything that came before it. You might be thinking, if every story has already been told, then how can anyone be original? Originality, at this point, comes from the way you tell those basic stories. Let me give an example. Hamburger. Somebody already invented the hamburger, but we are still coming up with new ideas for hamburgers to this day. If you take beef patties and sandwiched them between sesame seed buns, some cheese, lettuce, onions, pickles, and sauce, and add some marketing, that's not a hamburger. That's a Big Mac. Whereas if you take some other square-shaped beef patties and put them in the middle of some cheese, bacon, ketchup, mayo, and regular buns, that's a Baconator. Originality comes from the combination of little ingredients you use instead of the broad, big-picture dish. As I said, everything is inspired by everything that came before it, so we're both influenced and limited by what we know. You can't really come up with something new out of nothing. When you make something, it has to be made out of something. Think of a new color. Go ahead, do your best. You can't. I tried it too. It just looked like some weird brown rainbow blob, but it was made out of colors we've already seen before. What you can do, however, is take a combination of those light wavelengths and give it a new name, like chartreuse. First we had green, then yellow, and then somewhere down the line, somebody made chartreuse. So how do you use that concept for world building? You've probably heard the phrase, good artists borrow, great artists steal. That phrase isn't meant to be taken literally, usually. The way I interpret it is that if you take a bunch of small pieces of ideas from a bunch of different sources and then transform and combine them together in your own way, you'll end up with something new and original. You don't take an entire idea from something, just parts. Game of Thrones has swords in it. That's from real life. It also has dragons. That's fictional. It also has plots that are similar to real-life historical events. Did George R.R. Martin invent swords, or dragons, or the War of the Roses? No. Would any sane person try to say that he ripped off these historical and fictional ideas? No. In fact, a lot of people would argue that it's one of the most successful and unique fantasy series ever. So, in a very basic sense, my advice for originality is to steal ingredients, not recipes. Pull from a lot of different sources until this collection becomes something new, something that doesn't just resemble its individual parts anymore. Because at that point, you're being transformative and turning all these little pieces into something new instead of just ripping off someone else's work. The way you tell your story or build your world is what will make it original, as long as you're using your voice to tell it. If you're not sure what to put into your world and you're having some writer's block, write down literally anything. Whatever the first idea is that pops into your head. Even if it sucks, even if it's terrible, write it down. If you want, give it some time and come back to it later to look at it with fresh eyes. And you just might think, this is terrible, but if I change this and that, then suddenly your brain is gaining momentum and getting ideas for how to fix it. It's way easier to work with something instead of an empty canvas. And if you do suddenly get an idea for something, and you feel the gears in your head start turning, follow that as far as you can. Even if it's unrelated to the other things you've been working on, follow that inspiration because it's clearly interesting to you. If your world is full of ideas that excite you like that, then it's going to be an interesting world full of your vision. This kind of falls into the background priority tier from earlier, but sometimes you can find a way to connect these ideas to things in the other two tiers. I do think there needs to be a balance between following your inspirations like this and coming up with ideas for what's immediately in front of the players. So be reasonable with how you do this. Ideas for the world directly around the players should take priority just because you need that stuff to actually run the game. The players need places to go, or NPCs to talk to, or monsters to kill. Another method is to do a little introspection. Take a look at all the different media you like. the stories, books, movies, shows, and ask yourself what you like about those worlds. What about them inspires you, or makes your brain go, ooh, or oh, hell yeah. If you can figure out what those things are, take the essence of those ideas and find a way to fit them into your world. Remember, don't copy the entire recipe, just take the ingredients you like. Writing and world building can be difficult sometimes, but they don't have to be daunting. Just the idea of world building can make it seem like some monumental task if you're just starting out. If you're new, it's okay to start small. Write in terms of steps, not leaps, so you can figuratively find your footing. When you think of a world or a setting, you might only picture the big things like kingdoms and countries and continents, but worlds are also made up of a lot of little things too. So to summarize, if you're just starting out, you don't need a complete world, just one that can function for adventures. As the game goes on and the story develops, the player's view and understanding of the world can expand as you develop the world more. And if you're concerned about originality, just focus on putting things that you like into your setting, and don't be afraid to take inspiration from other kinds of media. The key word there being inspiration and not flat-out thievery. And lastly, if you're still not sure what you want to put into your world, just write down any ideas. Take those ideas, even if they're bad, and refine them into something you do like. It's so much easier to refine and transform something instead of nothing. That first step can be tough to get over, but once you're past it, the rest will come to you. You got this.